they'll get half a share, do half my job. So you have a mitzvah that seems to make no sense. And King Solomon says, Amarti achakma, I wanted to try and master this aspect of Torah, but it's too far, too distant from me, impossible to understand. And not only is it presented as an important mitzvah, but the way it is introduced is the words I just had on the screen, Zot Chukat HaTorah. This is the statute of the entire Torah. So it is given a breadth, a relevance way beyond the narrow context in which it was used. Because it doesn't say this is the statute of the cow or the red heifer. This is the statute of the red heifer. It says this is the statute of the Torah, which implies that there is a message that is within this specific mitzvah that relates to the entire Torah. And very briefly, our mitzvahs are divided into categories. And the three categories of our commandments are the mitzvahs, which we understand perfectly, and we would have come to formulate even if God did not tell us to do them. They are called mishpatim. So these are the mitzvahs that make such logical sense that they found their way into every constitution of any normal country. Do not steal, do not murder, respect property, have courts, okay, all of those laws that make absolute logical sense. In fact, the Gemara talks about why there was a need for God to command them, because they're so obvious to even the human understanding. That's one category of mitzvahs. Second category of mitzvahs are the mitzvahs that we wouldn't have thought of on our own, but once they were presented, we can relate to them very logically. Like the mitzvah of Pesach, we wouldn't have of our own volition thought up the idea of eating matzah for 7 days or 8 days, or drinking 4 cups of wine. Wouldn't have crossed our mind to institute such a thing, because it's not something that a human being would have thought of. But once God did tell us to do this, we can understand why it is important, because we're reliving the liberation of our people and all the explanations of the Seder night, so we can very logically understand the formula. That's the second category. We wouldn't have thought of it on our own, but once it was presented to us, we clearly understand it. And then this category that we talk about, this Shabbat, this is the statute of the Torah. It makes no sense whatsoever. So against logic it is that, as I said, it renders the pure impure, just as it renders the impure pure. The same ashes. The administrator of the ashes, the Kohen, becomes impure, and the person on whom those same ashes are administered becomes pure. So why would we say that this law is the law of the entire Torah? And very briefly, what we want to say is that there are many logical reasons why we keep laws. And our understanding of laws often gives us added impetus, momentum, intention to fulfill those commandments, and it helps us fulfill the commandments. We could understand why we keep Shabbat, because it's good to rest, and that's a good day to spend with the family, and we can give 1,001 reasons why Shabbat is good, and 1,001 reasons why it's good to honor parents, and why it's good not to steal, and why it's good to pay the employer on time. But deep down, within those mitzvahs that we do understand, we have to realize that there is something that transcends our understanding, even in the commandments that we do understand. And that Zot Chukat HaTorah is coming to tell us that there is a surrender of human understanding and mastery and thinking that we know it all and we clearly define destiny because we are so smart and so wise. Comes along a coronavirus and leaves us with so many questions that are unanswered. We don't know how long, we don't know when, we don't know how it's going to be cured. All the questions we ask, when we're going to be in shul, will we be in shul? All of the questions we left wanting. But sometimes God reminds us that we don't really master everything. And even in the commandments, which we so clearly understand logical reasons why we should fulfill them, we should not limit the scope of our practice to our own understanding, because human beings have done very foul things with their own human understanding. I was recently reading a lot of letters. I'm trying to work on a book, a biography about my father, Alav Shalom, and I was reading a lot of letters that related to Shechita, which my father was a sheikhet and back in Europe. And it is interesting that in 1937, Germany banned Shechita. You were not allowed to slaughter animals by the Jewish ritual law because it was inhumane, in their opinion, to animals. Where was this done? In Germany, 1937? You know what human minds can do? Human minds can take something and suddenly they are the masters of cruelty and knowing exactly how to be humane and do things just perfectly right. And within 2 years, Shechita was prohibited, but slaughtering children, innocent children, was absolutely warranted in their minds. Human beings have elastic understanding. Our minds can be reshaped in all kinds of directions because of subjectivity, and we are not as objective as we think we are. So Hashem's telling us, Zot Chukat Torah. You want to see the statute that you know nothing about and you cannot possibly fathom and understand the rationale behind it? This is an aspect of the entire Torah, not just about the red heifer. Because every aspect of the Torah, we have to realize that as finite human beings, we have to surrender our own understanding and recognize that we are just small little human beings in a huge universe governed by God, and we are subject to the power of God. Zot Chukat Torah, this statute of which we know nothing, no logical understanding, is in fact symbolic of the entire Torah, which transcends us. We try and understand as much as we can, but never put this infinite Torah into a tiny little frame of human mind and human understanding. We have to realize we don't package God into our minds. We rise to the occasion and surrender our own preferences for a recipe that is much bigger than ourselves. Okay, moving on. We're staying with different inspirations that could be derived. Okay, just in passing, it says that this powerful process of surrendering our own intellect, the red heifer actually came to redeem us from the calf. The way the Midrash tells us is let the mother resolve the problem of the calf. The mother cow, the red heifer, take care of that which we sinned with the golden calf when we served the golden calf in the desert. So doing something so illogical, so irrelevant to our lives as serving an idol, took something of rising completely above our intellect to resolve it. The mother cow took care of the calf. Okay, now just a thought that the Rebbe takes out of the situation that the ashes of the heifer purify the contaminated and contaminate the pure. So there was great risk in this process. The Kohen who was asked to assist the person who was contaminated and needed to become pure could very easily have said, I don't want to get involved because in so doing, I will become contaminated. If we think about the thousands and thousands of health workers around the world who have put themselves in the line of duty in these difficult times to assist others, even at risk of themselves becoming infected, that is a very huge human strength and ability. To sacrifice self for the needs of others, that is a powerful, powerful process. And the Rebbe says when we look at the world around us and we see that there is impurity, that there are Jews that are not involved in shul and the Jewish community, they've lost their path, they've lost their way. And people will say, well, what's it my problem? I don't have to get involved. Why should I go and try and pick up somebody else if in the process I might be pulled down? I got my own problems. Why should I worry about a Jew on the other side of the world or on the other side of the road or on the other side of the community, the other side of the pew in shul, whichever one it is? Why is his problem my problem? And if I get involved, who knows how I might be diminished? This whole mitzvah reminds us that we should never stop to help and assist somebody else, even if it puts us to a degree of risk, because that is what we put into this world to do. And it is our responsibility to lift others, even if we think it might be at our own risk. And ultimately, our greatest strength, ironically, our greatest strength comes from giving and contributing and helping others. That actually builds us and makes us stronger. Now, I want to just go through a definition of Mayim Chaim, because in the purification process, it often talks about water. And it says that water, in order for it to be able to bring purity, as in a mikveh, it's not just H2O that comes out of a tap. It is water that's called Mayim Chaim. Ideally, a spring, a natural spring. Basil's with us over here. Basil came with me once to the spring of the Arizal mikveh in December in Israel, in Tzfat, when it was about 2 degrees or less. It was freezing, and the water was absolutely freezing. That's called Mayim Chaim, fresh water straight from the spring. But mikveh utilizes a process of storing pure rainwater without it having gone through any processing, because it has to be natural. The Talmud actually talks about Mayim Chaim, living waters, has to be, if it's a river, not a perennial river. It has to be a river that flows the entire year. It has to be a constant inflow. And the Talmud then says, because this is what truth is all about. Truth is not sometimes, is not when you're in the mood, is not on Wednesdays. Truth is every day of our life and every minute of our life, and it is forever. It is infinite. So anything that is not absolutely constant is in fact not absolutely true. So in Chassidus it says, if that's the definition of real life and real truth, that living means that the river has to flow all the time and never be interrupted, not just a downpour where there's a flood and it comes down the mountain and you have, like you have in the Sinai desert, in the Negev, where you have shitfanim, you have terrible floods that come down in a rush, and then it's gone. Then it's desert again. It has to be constantly flowing. So it says, so what is true? In this world, nothing is really true, because everything is temporary and everything's here for a duration of time, and everything eventually withers. So the words that we say every time we take the Torah out and we put it on the bimah, may we do that soon in Shul. The words that we say is V'atem hadveikim b'Hashem Elokeichem, and you who cleave to the Lord your God, Chayim kulchem hayom, you are alive. We are alive if we attach ourselves to that which is eternal. When we connect ourselves to the Torah, to the vibrancy of the Word of God, which is infinite and transcends time and place, when we connect ourselves to that by doing a single mitzvah, finite human being touches the divine and the infinite, and we become an extension of it. We cannot live forever, but we could make a moment in time, an eternal moment, by doing the right thing. Because when we do tzedakah and we do chesed and we lift up another human being and we do a kindness, that moment is transformed into an infinite strength. That's the challenge. And that's the definition of truth. Truth is always and forever. And there are only a few forever things in this world. And when we attach ourselves to them, then we ourselves have a newfound definition of life. Now, moving on. The story of Miriam. Miriam was the one who passes away, and immediately after that she passes away, there's no water, and they complain, and then Moses is told to speak to the rock, and he hits the rock. So we actually told that there were the gifts that we had in the desert were as a result of the merit of individuals. So in the merit of Moses, we had the manna. In the merit of Aaron, we had the cloud cover that protected us. And in the merit of Miriam, we had water. Now Miriam passes away and there is no water. Now the Midrash tells us an interesting thing. What happened to the well of Miriam, it says? It says if you go up onto the mountain of Carmel, which happens to be in Haifa, quite well removed from where the Jewish people are presently in the desert, if you go out from the mountain of Carmel and you look out to sea, you'll see what looks like a sieve in the water. And that is the well of Miriam. What's the Midrash talking about? What's Mount Carmel got to do with Miriam in the desert? So if we take this beyond the obvious, that Miriam gave us water, we were thirsty, we needed to drink, and we got water. Miriam represents the vitality of our people. She represents enabling a parched and weary people to be revived. She restored soul when everyone had lost it, again and again. And she gave us the strength as a woman to find the water, the living waters, even in the darkest moments of Jewish history. And it all started when she was a little girl, when she stood by the water, by the river Nile, and she watched over her brother, her baby brother Moses, who was put into the Nile because otherwise he faced immediate death by the decree of Pharaoh. And there she was, Miriam, looking after her brother. But prior to that, she is the one, tells us the Medrash, that looked at her parents and realized that her father had stopped being the husband to her mother. They actually had moved out of each other's presence. And even as a young girl, she was trying to understand what had happened to their family. And what she understood was, and she was told, was that her parents said, there is no purpose in carrying on with life as we know it, we considered normal. What's normal today? We don't know what normal is, but normal life, that we continue to bring generations into the world, to bring children into a world that is so evil, that faces the possibility of death, a cruel world like this, we don't want to be part of this at all. And little Miriam, as a young girl, turns to her father and says to her father, don't you realize Pharaoh only decreed against the male children? But if you do not continue with a zest for life and a commitment to living, then you will destroy not only the male children, you'll destroy the girl children as well. Your decree is even worse than Pharaoh. Despondency, giving up, is even a greater tragedy for the Jewish people than what our worst enemies can do to us. Miriam was the symbol of hope amidst the most terrible times. And thereafter, Levi goes out and he marries and remarries and brings a child into the world. And who is this child? Moses. You never know where, if you stand up with hope and with belief and with a commitment to life, what the next move can achieve and what it can accomplish, what the next stage in the entire storyline is unfolding. It was Moses, and Moses was the Yeshua, the salvation of the Jewish people. So Miriam represents the ability to look past the difficulties of the hour, not to be caught up in the tragedy, in the difficulty, in the challenges, in being overwhelmed by the problem, but looking with hope and with a fervor and injecting into the most desperate moments the possibilities of hope. And that's why the Midrash says, if you go up to Mount Carmel, what happened on Mount Carmel? Mount Carmel was where you had Elijah the prophet with all the false prophets of Baal, and the Jewish people were on the last shoestring of hope because all the people were following the prophets of Baal. And Eliyahu on the mountain of Carmel challenges the prophets in front of the Jewish people. And he says, let us determine who is in fact the true God of the Jewish people. And let's see whose offerings will be responded to by fire. And cut the long story short, he tells them to prepare their offerings, and they pray, and they do everything they can. They start cutting their flesh, and they do all kinds of acts of sacrifice to try and elicit the fire that would come from heaven. It never comes. And then Elijah says, bring water, and he puts water onto the sacrifice, which would make it least able to burn, and a fire comes from heaven, and everyone said, Hashem, Hu Elokim, the words we say at the end of Yom Kippur, the Lord is our God, the Lord is our God. We say 7 times at the end of Yom Kippur, comes from this whole story, and the story was on Mount Carmel. Says the Midrash, if you want to know where this well of Miriam is, it's all over. It's just across our shoulders. We just have to lift our eyes. Because again and again, in the most difficult, dark, painful pages of our history, the Jewish people were looking for hope. It's the story of Miriam, this little girl who in the midst of such terrible pain was able to find hope and to engender the people around her with hope. It changed everything. And that's how we change our own lives. That's how Elijah did it on Mount Carmel. And that's how we do it in Johannesburg. And that's how we do it in Israel. And that's how we do it in every situation in our lives, is to think of a young girl called Miriam who brought the waters when everyone was thirsting and thought there was no possibility of survival. Her waters were not just the H2O that we drank when we were thirsty. They were the remedy for a soul that had withered and that needed new life. She gave it to us, and we have the possibility of tapping it if we only recognize the power that she gave us. Moving on from Miriam, this powerful young lady, okay, there's a lot of things that I want to do. So let's just talk about the episode of talking to the rock. And Moses, instead of talking to the rock, he hits the rock. A lot of questions were asked by all the commentaries. What was the issue here? God says to Moses, take your stick and go and talk to the rock. Last time, which happened when they didn't have water, God said, take your stick and hit the rock. And Moses hit the rock and water came out. This time, God says, take your stick. So the stick somehow was relevant, and talk to the rock. And instead of talking to the rock, Moses hits the rock. And as a result of that, water comes out. Everyone's no longer thirsty. As a result of that, Moses is not allowed into the promised land. Terrible punishment to a person who went through 40 years of leading us through the desert, and he couldn't realize his dream of getting to the promised land. What was so terrible? And just let's think about this theme of words, of talking, because it comes up again and again in so many different contexts in both of these portions. Talk to the rock. He hits the rock. Then you have the attempt to talk and use the power of words to curse the Jewish people. Then you have donkeys talking. You have all of these strange inferences about the power of speech. I've told you that when I was a little kid, I made up a limerick, and the limerick went as follows. Sticks and stones may break my bones. But words can do even better. There's a power that's more than the weapons of war, and it's a sword without its first letter. Sword without its first letter is the word. And the power of words is very, very, very strong. Hashem wanted to communicate the power of words. And on this occasion, he wanted the Jewish people to see that if you talk and you are utilizing your human capacity of communication, you can affect worlds. You can transform destinies by the way we use our words. So it was by a very special design that Hashem wanted Moshe Rabbeinu to talk to the rock on this occasion. And then to demonstrate if a rock listens, why my Jewish people, are you not listening? Even a rock responds to words, and you, my Jewish people, do not. One of the commentaries explains why Moses sacrifices, in fact, himself and his destiny of being able to get into the promised land, because he didn't want this to come to fruition. He didn't want God to use this against the Jewish people. The rock listens and delivers water, and the Jewish people listen and they don't. They don't. He actually wanted, he used, as a defense of the Jewish people, he didn't want to have them cornered by the episode of speaking to the rock. That was the greatness of Moshe Rabbeinu, to risk himself. But there are many, many commentaries. Some of them talk about the fact that it seems to imply that Moses, at his level, expressed a degree of anger, that he was angry at the Jewish people, that he called the Jewish people rebels. And Jonathan Sachs, just saying very briefly, so brilliantly has insight, says that he will venture to say something that is of his own, but he has broad shoulders to even attempt to say something. And he said that sometimes when it comes to the changes in the world, changes of generations, there's a new need, a new method of getting to a particular generation. And what God was demonstrating is that Moses' time had to be replaced. It was now Joshua's time. And the period of Moses, where he was able to rule over and have the power and the strength, and even at times used his stick to keep everybody in line, the next generation were not necessarily going to be moved by the same instruments. They needed the speech rather than the stick. And this was the transition point from Moses to the next generation. Okay, it's perhaps reading into the verses more than the obvious, but just a thought about time sometimes requiring a different approach, not a different Torah, not a different set of rules, but a different method of communicating those rules. And that's why in each generation, there are rabbis today that are successful that would not have been successful 100 years ago. And some of those rabbis of 200 years ago would have struggled in the world that we live in today, because each generation needs leaders that are going to be relevant and appropriate to that particular season. At any rate, we see the power of words again and again, and the fact that Bilam, who is this all-powerful individual who thinks he's going to curse the Jewish people and bring about the destiny that he wants, is in fact unable to do so, and that he is humbled by a donkey that begins to talk where he cannot say one word other than what God tells him to say. It's interesting how the power of words can be used to build. As the Gemara says, it's all in the tongue. The tongue can kill and the tongue can revive. The tongue can cause great damage and can cause great healing. So if we use words appropriately, then we actually can be great architects of positive change. Now I want to share, which was I've kept this, was the advert that we put out for tonight's Shiur, which is circumstance. Is it our stance or our circumstance? Which one is it that defines us? So you've probably heard this from me before, because this is one of my great thoughts and ideas that I've repeated so many times, and that is that the Jewish people have a mitzvah to daven. And when we daven, we actually have a preference to always pray in the same place. There's actually a preference to have your own seat in the shul and to always daven in the same seat in the shul. Not worth arguing or fighting about, not worth having an argument, a machlekes, or having an argument with the person who happened to venture into your seat. You're probably better off foregoing it. But ideally, without any of these external issues, better to always stand in the same place. How do we know this? Because when it came to Abraham Avinu, so we're told in the story in the book of Genesis that he went to pray for the people of Sodom. And in spite of all of his prayers, God tells him that Sodom's got to go. It's irredeemable. And Sodom is destroyed. So Moses, in fact, failed in his prayer. He asked God to save, and God said no. And then immediately after this episode, it says, Vayashkem Avram, and Avram got up early, El Hamakom Asher Amad, and he went back to the same place that he stood previously. And the Gemara learns that Amad, to stand, is not just standing, but it means to stand in prayer. He went back to pray to God, to the same place. It's emphasized that he went to the same place. And from there we learn in the Gemara that we should always try and go to the same place. And I'm contrasting this with our personality called Bilam, who comes to curse the Jewish people. Because what happens again and again in our portion is that he tries to curse, and out comes blessing. So what does he say to King Balak, who has summoned him and who's going to pay him well if he will curse the Jewish people? He says, I'm going to take you to another place, but and from there it's going to work. And on each failure, he addresses his failure by saying, let's go somewhere else. Let's take it to a different vantage point. Let's put ourselves in a new circumstance. Because the failure that has happened has obviously got to do with the fact that we were standing in the wrong time or in the wrong place. It was the circumstances around me that brought my failure. So what change can I bring about to succeed this time? What I have to change is I have to change my circumstance. I've got to change by going to a different place. So we contrast the personality of Avraham Avinu, who fails, and then immediately goes back and it's emphasized to the same place. Because Abraham's message to us, from himself, to himself, and eventually to us, is that if you fail, dig deeper. Look into yourself more. Find strength that you didn't know you had until now. Don't be distracted and think that this has to do with the place that you're standing in. This has to do with who you are. And if you dig deeper, this time you'll succeed. And that's the method of addressing failure. It is to look at ourselves and to look for ourselves and to find the strength from ourselves. And Bilam, by contrast, is constantly saying, how could I fail? Whose fault is it? What am I the victim of? Whose fault is it this time? So we'll move here, we'll move there, and he's constantly on the move looking for the new opportunities that are going to make him success. So we have this, this is so relevant to all of our lives. Do we succeed or fail by the circumstances that surround us? Or do we succeed or fail by the way we respond to the circumstances that surround us? Is it the stance that we take, or is it the circumstance that we find ourselves in? And all of us could do so much for our own selves. If we look at our lives and stop saying it's because of the coronavirus, and it's because of my parents, or because of my teachers, or because of my rabbi, or because of my shul, or because of whatever. We all have reasons that we could, hooks that we could hang all of our failures on and say, this had least to do with me, it has everything to do with everything around me. So all I've got to do is I've got to be a good traveler. I've got to keep moving. This school didn't work for my kids, we'll try the next school. This teacher didn't work, obviously it's not my kid's the teacher. So we've got to change the teacher. We've got to change the country. We've got to immigrate. And we've got to constantly look and find for all the changes that are going to create the success of our lives. And we could possibly be searching all our life for something that eludes us. Because the real place that is going to make the great amount of difference is the change that happens in us and through us, rather than to us. So if any message can be derived from a double portion that speaks about so many wonderful messages, let's just take this one about realizing that it's not the circumstance, but our response to circumstance that ultimately defines who we are. And the strength comes from recognizing the power of Miriam and the power of belief and faith, and the strength of words used appropriately, and the strength of being able to be brave enough to confront our failures and say, maybe it's not in our stars that we are indolent. How did he say? He says, as the bard once said, it's not in our stars but in ourselves that we are underlings. We have to be brave enough to accept that it's not because of all the things around us, but it's maybe much closer to home. I'm going to open up everyone so I can say good night, because otherwise you can push the mute button, which is also not so good. I can't actually. If you would like to undo it, you can undo yourself. I can't undo you for some reason. So I want to just wish everyone a good night. Thank you for joining. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. Wonderful week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks for joining, Sandy. Thank you, Shana, for coming.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you,
Thank
Rabbi.
you, Lawrence. Nice to see you. Thank
Enjoying
you
it. Thank you. Thank you. It's therapy.
Yeah.
Thank you from the burgers.
Thank you for joining us, Felicity. And regards to the whole family, to Jaime and to everybody.
Thank you, you too, Rabbi.
Thank you, Sydney, for joining us. Thank you, Lawrence. Regards to the whole family.
Chukat, Rabbi.
Thanks.
Have a good night.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. It was really great.
This is one should normally
Bye-bye.
Rabbi.
pray